In 2007, I was working with a tour company called Tourmobile, and we used to do tours through Washington, D.C., as well as Arlington National Cemetery. I used to love doing tours through Arlington National Cemetery, and our first stop was the Kennedy gravesite, and we would sit there for 8 minutes, which gave me an opportunity to do interpretations for about 8 minutes. And I would talk about something that was somehow related to the cemetery. One of those stories I would talk about was the Schweinfurt raids, which took place during World War II in 1943. The United States Army Air Force flew 2 missions to Schweinfurt. The first was in August, the second one was in October. And I would talk about those raids and just how devastating those 2 raids were. Now, I released a film back in August that talked about the Schweinfurt missions, particularly the mission itself. But this particular film doesn't necessarily talk about the missions per se, but it actually highlights one particular individual who flew that mission, the October mission, October 14th mission. Ken Burns had released his documentary, The War, which was about World War II, and it came out September of 2007. Well, in episode 2, I think it was entitled When Things Get Tough, he introduces us to Earl Burke from Sacramento, California. Now, I'm watching this episode and I'm listening to Earl Burke tell his story. He says he started in the Army. His older brother Tommy was killed during World War II. I think in a training mission, and that was sort of like his motivation. He was going to go and win this war, single-handedly. And so he ended up joining the Army, and one of the first things he said was, he says, "Buck Private, you salute everything that moves and you paint everything that does not." He ended up catching up with some of his friends from Sacramento. They were twin brothers who were in the Army Air Force, and he's checking out the uniforms. He says, "Man, you guys got it made." He says, "Yeah, why don't you join? It's volunteer, but you can join." And so Earl Burke ended up joining the United States Army Air Force. Now, he talked about, he was a ball turret gunner, and a ball turret is the location underneath the B-17 or the B-24 that protects the underside of the aircraft. And he said, he's flying in there for the first time and he's trying to figure this thing out. He says, after a few minutes, he figured out the pedals and how to make the thing turn. And if I am not mistaken, I believe his first mission was that second raid on Schweinfurt, October 14th, 1943. And those missions were absolutely horrendous. The first mission that was flown to Schweinfurt, they lost 60 bombers. That's 600 individuals who were either killed, missing in action, or taken prisoner. Earl Burke is on that second one in October 14th, and guess what? They lose an additional 60 bombers. Now, that's 1,200 individuals who were either killed, missing in action, or taken prisoner in 2 raids. They were flying missions in between those 2 and losing crews as well. So it was very hard for the Army Air Force in 1943. Earl Burke is on that mission, and while he's flying, he talks about a German shell came through his ball turret, hit him in his arm, continued into the aircraft and killed the waist gunner. Now, he credited the Boy Scouts of America that taught him how to do a tourniquet, and he ended up tying a tourniquet around his arm, and it saved his arm because he probably would have lost it. He's bleeding out at 25,000 feet or so, and the blood is dripping into the bottom of his ball turret, and it's freezing. And he said it was like marbles rolling around, and he's picking it up, throwing it out. And he talks about just how difficult that was. Well, while I'm watching the episode, I'm thinking to myself, because I know exactly where this story is headed, I'm thinking he's telling the same story that I've been telling in Arlington. He's plagiarizing me. And I guess I thought that for about 5 seconds, and then I realized, wait a minute, he's not telling my story. I have been telling his story. And so that episode ends, and I'm thinking, wow, this guy is amazing. I go online, I Google, and I find Earl Burke from Sacramento, California. And I'm sitting there with, the phone number and my phone in my hand. I'm like, should I call him? Should I call him? And listen, I'm like, he don't know me from nobody, right? I worked up the courage and I called. When I called, a woman answered the phone and I was like, Mrs. Burke? And that telemarketing voice, and she's like, yes. And I said, ma'am, my name is John McCaskill from Washington, D.C. I just finished watching Ken Burns' episode 2, and I saw a gentleman by the name of Earl Burke. I'm wondering if this is the same Earl Burke. She's like, yes. And she and I get into a conversation, and we talk for about 20 minutes. She doesn't know me. But at that point, she warms up to me, and we talk for like 20 minutes. Now, you have to understand, that's how I grew up. On the block that I grew up, in the neighborhood I grew up, every child was a child of every parent. And so parents were welcoming like that to young people. And she talked to me as if she had known me since I was a child, right? Essentially, that's what it was. And so after about 20 minutes, I asked her, I said, well, listen, I was calling, I'd like to talk to Mr. Burke. And she says, he's in the hospital. And I'm like, really? What's wrong? Is he okay? He's okay. She says, oh yeah, he's fine. She says he fell and hurt his back, but he'll be fine. I was like, oh, okay, man. Well, Ms. Burke, I was just calling to say thank you. And I got the idea before I got off the phone. I said, Ms. Burke, can I write him a letter? She says, oh yeah, we'll make sure he gets it. So we got off the phone and I ended up writing a letter. And what I wrote to him essentially was the exact same story I'm telling now. Heard his story and just wanted to thank him for his service. Now, that was September 24th, I called her, 2007, September 24th, and I probably sent the letter within the week. So maybe the first week of October, I sent the letter, right? About 9 months later, May, it's Memorial Day, 2008, and I'm thinking, maybe I should call Mr. Burke, maybe I should call him. So I get the courage to call him again. This time, 2 people answer the phone, a man and a woman. But at that point, I had a relationship with Mrs. Burke. And so I asked for Mrs. Burke. And she was like, yeah, speaking. And so she starts talking. I said, Ms. Burke, this is John McCaskill. I called you back. And she remembered, right? And we talked. I'm like, how you doing? But she was so cordial, so cool and everything. And I said, well, yeah, I just wanted to call and I just wanted to talk to Mr. Burke. And she paused and said, he passed. And I'm sitting there like, what do I say? And I don't know what to say. And so I ended up thanking her. I said, well, Mrs. Burke, I just want to thank you for sharing him with the world, right? But here's the thing. Before we got off the phone, she told me that she received my letter, that he got my letter, right? My thank you letter. And so we got off the phone and I'm sitting there stunned and I'm not really sure why. And I had to ask myself the question, why am I so moved by an individual I had not met? And yet I had met him and the 16 million others who served during World War II. And that thing affected me. And it got to me. And so I ended up Googling Earl Burke. And it turned out that Mr. Burke passed October 17, 2007. That was around 2 weeks from the time I sent the letter. Now, it's stories like these and so many others that I do, or is the reason why I do World War II reenacting. And a lot of the other guys and gals who do this, that's why we do it. To tell these stories and keep these stories going. I mean, these are tremendous stories that you don't hear much about. And you don't want these stories to get lost. And and many of us have so many other stories. And I've done films on some of these other stories of it with individuals. And that's why we do it. My group, Allied Airmen's Preservation Society. And that's why we do it. But there are two lessons that we can learn from this story. Number one, and I tell this story when I've had students down to World War II Memorial, I tell them this story because a lot of what we see in this story, we don't see much these days. And one of the first lessons is this: there is no greater expression of love or devotion than someone who's willing to lay their life down for someone else, who's willing to sacrifice for someone else. And, I remember that thing Mr. Burke said. He says, look, I hated getting into that plane, but I didn't want to let my friends down. My friends were getting into that plane. And you don't see that type of sacrifice these days when people are willing to sacrifice for someone else. I mean, today it's just what can you do for me? What have you done for me lately? The second thing is, you don't squander opportunities, especially any opportunity you don't want to squander, especially when it pertains to thanking someone else, because you know what? You're not going to always have that opportunity. Your parents, people who've done stuff, listen, you don't wait. And the sad part about it is, young people, they don't really experience that. But had I waited a week or two, I would have missed my opportunity. The satisfaction of knowing that he got my letter. I never met him, but I was able to express my gratitude to him. And that's something that we should always have gratitude. We should always have a thankful heart. Leaders, heroes don't have to advertise, publicize, or sensationalize themselves, because their works will speak for them. Check out our website at www.jwmhistoryalive.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And if you want more films, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel at John W. McCaskill. This is John W. McCaskill, History Alive.